For centuries, the most powerful book ever written has been called a myth, a collection of stories invented by desert wanderers trying to explain a world they could not understand. Scholars dismissed it, scientists questioned it, historians debated it, and for a long time, the argument seemed settled: the Bible was faith, not fact. But then something unexpected started happening. Archaeologists began pulling objects out of the ground that matched biblical accounts with stunning precision. Stone inscriptions carved by Israel's enemies confirmed kings that critics said never existed. Ancient weather science explained miracles that were supposed to be impossible. And the more they dug, the more the ground gave back. This is not a religious argument. This is archaeology. And what it has found will make you question everything you thought you knew. There is a reason the Bible has survived for thousands of years while entire civilizations have collapsed around it. There is a reason it remains the best-selling book in human history, with an estimated 5 billion copies ever produced and distributed across every corner of the world. That reason is not simply faith. That reason is not simply tradition. Part of the reason is that embedded within its pages, between the prayers and the prophecies and the parables, there appears to be something that looks, under serious archaeological examination, like genuine historical memory, not perfect, not without exaggeration, but real, in ways that continue to surprise even the scholars who approach these texts with the deepest skepticism. The story of how archaeology has repeatedly forced historians to revise their dismissal of the Bible is one of the most compelling and least told stories in the history of human knowledge. And it begins not with faith, but with a stone slab pulled from the Egyptian desert in 1896. Before diving into the discoveries themselves, it is worth establishing what the scholarly consensus actually says about the Bible, because many people on both sides of this debate misrepresent it. The mainstream academic position is not that the Bible is entirely fictional, nor is it that the Bible is entirely factual. The position that most serious historians hold is considerably more nuanced and considerably more interesting than either of those extremes. Scholars generally agree, based on multiple independent lines of evidence, that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical figure. The consensus holds that he was baptized by John the Baptist, that he engaged in public debate with Jewish religious authorities, and that he was crucified under the authority of Pontius Pilate, who served as the 5th governor of the Roman province of Judea. These are not conclusions drawn from Christian sources alone. Jesus and his followers are referenced in writings by Roman historians, including Pliny the Younger and the historian Tacitus, who had no religious motivation to mention him and every political motivation to ignore him. Yet they wrote about him anyway, because he was part of the historical record they were documenting. What remains genuinely contested is almost everything else: the miracles, the resurrection, the precise details of his teachings and travels. And critically, despite centuries of searching, no physical relic or artifact directly connected to Jesus has ever been authenticated. Every claimed relic has failed to survive serious scholarly scrutiny. But Jesus is not the primary focus of the archaeological discoveries that have been reshaping our understanding of the Bible's historical accuracy. The more remarkable story, and the one that has produced the most concrete physical evidence, involves the Old Testament, the ancient historical record of the Israelite people. For most of modern academic history, the Old Testament was treated by scholars essentially as national mythology, a collection of founding stories that a people told about themselves, inspiring, culturally significant, spiritually powerful, but not to be taken seriously as a chronicle of real events. The Israelites, in this view, had created a grand narrative about their origins and their relationship with God. And while that narrative shaped their identity and their civilization, it did not necessarily reflect what had actually happened in the ancient Near East. This was the consensus: comfortable, settled, and as it turned out, increasingly difficult to defend, as archaeologists started making discoveries that no one had predicted and no one could easily dismiss. The first, and perhaps most foundational discovery, came in 1896, when an archaeologist working in Thebes, Egypt, uncovered a large stone inscription that would permanently alter the scholarly conversation about the historical reality of ancient Israel. The inscription was created by Merneptah, who was the son of Rameses the Great and served as pharaoh of Egypt for approximately 10 years during the late 13th century BC. The stone itself is 28 lines long, and for most of those 28 lines it chronicles Merneptah's military campaigns and his victories over the ancient Libyans, standard royal propaganda of the ancient world, designed to document the pharaoh's power and dominance. But then something unexpected happens in the final 3 lines. The text shifts away from Libya entirely and moves to the region of Canaan, and there, carved in stone by the hand of an Egyptian royal scribe more than 3,000 years ago, appear these words about a people in Canaan: Israel is laid waste. 3 words that changed everything, because that inscription, now known as the Merneptah Stele, is the oldest known non-biblical reference to Israel ever discovered anywhere in the world. It is also the only reference to Israel that has ever been found from ancient Egypt. Think about what that means. At a time when many scholars were arguing that the early Israelites were a mythological people invented by later writers, an Egyptian pharaoh's official royal monument was already treating Israel as a real nation significant enough to mention by name in a victory inscription. The Merneptah Stele confirms beyond any reasonable dispute that Israel existed as an independent nation with its own distinct culture and identity, occupying land in Canaan as far back as at least the 13th century BC. The Old Testament's claim that the Israelites were a real people with a real national identity and a real geographical location was not myth. It was history. And the proof came not from the Bible itself, but from one of its greatest historical adversaries. The confirmation of Israel's existence as a nation opened the door to deeper questions. If the Israelites were real, what about the specific figures the Bible describes? What about the kings, the warriors, the rulers who shaped Israelite history? For decades, one figure in particular stood at the center of this debate, King David, arguably the most fully realized human character in the entire biblical narrative. David's story is extraordinary by any literary standard. He came from complete obscurity, a poor family, the smallest and least significant of 8 brothers, a shepherd boy with no political connections and no obvious path to power. He killed a giant. He became a warrior. He was secretly anointed as Israel's true king by the prophet Samuel. He conquered Jerusalem and transformed it into Israel's political and cultural capital. He defeated the Philistines so completely that they ceased to be a meaningful military threat to Israel for generations. He was flawed, deeply human, capable of both extraordinary courage and profound moral failure. And for a long time, mainstream scholars believed he was entirely invented, a legendary figure created to give the Israelite monarchy a heroic founding myth, the way many ancient cultures created legendary founding figures who probably never existed in historical reality. Then came 1993, and an archaeological team working at a site called Tel Dan in northern Israel made a discovery that nobody had been looking for, and nobody was fully prepared to process. While studying remnants of an ancient stone structure, they found fragments of an inscription carved in Aramaic. The inscription was not complete, portions were missing, and some sections were damaged beyond recovery, but enough remained to read, and what it said was electrifying. The text described military victories over 2 kings of Israel. The first name was partially damaged, but almost certainly read as Jehoram, the son of Ahab. The second king was not named directly, but was identified by his lineage as the king of the house of David. The house of David, written in stone by Israel's enemies, approximately 150 years after the time when King David would have lived and died. This inscription, now known as the Tel Dan inscription, is dated to the 9th century BC, and its implications are significant on multiple levels. Consider the logic of the timeline. If King David had been a fictional character invented by Israelite writers to create a mythological founding dynasty, why would a foreign power writing in Aramaic, not Hebrew, be using that invented dynasty's name to identify a king, less than 2 centuries after that fictional king supposedly lived? Fraudulent royal lineages typically emerge centuries after the fact, when the invented ancestor is safely distant enough that no one can challenge the claim. 150 years is not enough distance to convincingly fabricate a dynasty around a king who never existed. The people writing this inscription in Aramaic were not Israelites trying to glorify their own history. They were enemies of Israel, recording their own military victories. They had no motivation to reference a fictional Israelite king. They referenced the House of David because the House of David was a real and recognized institution, a dynasty that everyone in the region knew was descended from a real king named David. Beyond this central revelation, the inscription also provides indirect confirmation of specific passages from the biblical Book of Kings. The language of the inscription is Aramaic, the language of the Aramean people. According to the Bible, Jehoram was killed by the Aramean king Hazael. The dates of Hazael's known reign align precisely with the dating of the Tel Dan inscription. If this conflict had been an internal Israelite matter, the inscription would have been written in Hebrew. The fact that it is in Aramaic points directly to the involvement of an Aramean power, exactly as the Bible describes. The Tel Dan inscription is not absolute proof that King David existed as the Bible portrays him, but it is powerful, credible, independently sourced evidence that a dynasty bearing his name was real, recognized, and historically significant in the ancient Near East. If the evidence for King David shifted from absence to strong probability, the evidence surrounding King Solomon presents a more complicated and more debated picture. Solomon, in the biblical account, is presented as the wisest and wealthiest ruler Israel ever produced, a king whose reign was defined not by war, but by construction, diplomacy, and a level of cultural and architectural achievement that made Israel the envy of the ancient world. He was one of what Jewish tradition counts as 48 prophets. His famous judgment, the story in which he proposed cutting a disputed baby in half in order to reveal which woman was the true mother, knowing the real mother would immediately sacrifice her claim to save her child's life, is one of the most analyzed stories in the history of jurisprudence and psychology. Most scholars consider it more likely to be a wisdom parable than a literal historical event, primarily because nearly identical stories appear across multiple cultures in that region. In Solomon's written version, while the oldest surviving text of the story may have been preceded by oral traditions that predate his reign. There are no references to Solomon in any historical texts from outside the Bible, a fact that initially led many scholars to doubt his existence entirely. But this absence requires context to interpret correctly. Solomon's reign was, according to the Bible, uniquely peaceful. No wars were fought, no foreign armies were defeated, and historical records from 3,000 years ago are extraordinarily rare under the best circumstances. Ancient civilizations wrote about each other primarily when they were fighting each other. A king who maintained peace and focused on building projects simply would not appear in neighboring civilizations' records the way a warrior king would. The absence of external documentation, in Solomon's specific case, is much less meaningful than it would be for a king whose reign involved the kind of military conflict that would naturally generate written records on multiple sides. What archaeology has produced instead of written records is architectural evidence. Excavations at 3 separate ancient Israelite sites, Hazer, Gezer, and Megiddo, have uncovered 6-chambered gates that share a remarkably consistent architectural design. The dating of these gates places them in the 10th century BC, which is precisely when biblical chronology places Solomon's reign. The Bible specifically describes large-scale construction projects at Hazer, Gezer, and Megiddo under Solomon's direction. The discovery of identically designed monumental gates at all 3 sites, dating to the right period, is difficult to explain as coincidence. The most natural explanation is that they were built as part of a coordinated construction program, exactly the kind of program a powerful, wealthy, centralized Israelite monarchy would have undertaken. There is genuine scholarly disagreement about the dating, particularly at Gezer, where some researchers argue the gates may have been built later than the 10th century BC. This debate has not been fully resolved, but if the 10th century dating holds at all 3 sites, the physical evidence at Hazer, Gezer, and Megiddo provides meaningful corroboration of the Bible's account of Solomon's construction achievements, even if the legendary scale of his wealth and wisdom was embellished in the telling. In 1868, in what is now modern Jordan, a discovery was made that provided perhaps the most dramatically confirmed example of the Bible's historical accuracy, not through silence or indirect inference, but through a direct parallel account of the same specific war written from the opposing side. The discovery was a large stone monument found at the ancient site of Dibon. When news of the stone reached the wider world, it triggered a geopolitical scramble that resulted in one of the most destructive moments in the history of archaeology. France, England, and Germany all aggressively pursued acquisition of the artifact, recognizing its potential historical significance. The Bani Hamida tribe, who held possession of the stone, had no intention of surrendering it to foreign powers. In a dramatic act of defiance against colonial acquisition, they heated the stone over fire and then poured cold water over it, shattering it into dozens of fragments. Those pieces were then sold separately on the antiquities market. Scholars and institutions have spent more than a century attempting to locate and reassemble the fragments, and while many have been recovered, the stone remains permanently incomplete. What survives is still extraordinary. The stone contains 34 lines of text, and it opens with words that establish its author immediately. I am Mesha, son of Kamoshgad, king of Moab. The Mesha Stele, as it came to be known, or the Moabite stone, is a royal victory monument, a record of who Mesha was and what he had achieved militarily. In the text, Mesha describes in considerable detail his war against the Israelites and their king Jehoram, and that war, that specific conflict between Moab and Israel involving that specific king, is described in the biblical book of Kings. The 2 accounts do not match perfectly, and this is precisely what makes them so credible to historians. The Mesha Stele emphasizes Moab's victories, the cities captured, the Israelite territories taken, the dominance Mesha established over his enemies. The biblical account, predictably, emphasizes Israel's successful counterattacks and frames the conflict in terms of Israelite resilience. Each account highlights the victories of its own side and minimizes its own defeats. This is not contradiction. This is exactly what authentic historical records from opposing sides of a real conflict look like. If someone had fabricated one of these accounts based on the other, the details would either match too perfectly or contradict irreconcilably. Instead, they describe the same events from genuinely different perspectives, the way eyewitnesses on opposing sides of a battle always describe the same battle differently. The Mesha Stele does not simply confirm that one biblical story is true. It confirms that the general historical framework of the Old Testament's account of Israelite history, the wars, the kings, the neighboring kingdoms, the specific political dynamics of the ancient Near East reflects real events that were recorded by multiple independent parties from multiple perspectives. Of all the stories in the Bible, Perhaps none has been more thoroughly dismissed by secular scholars as pure mythology than the account of Moses parting the Red Sea. It is the defining miracle of the Exodus narrative, the moment when an entire people escaped slavery, walked across the floor of a sea, and watched the waters return to destroy their pursuers. It appears in paintings and sculptures. It has been depicted in films watched by hundreds of millions of people, and for most of modern history, the scholarly position on it was simple. It did not happen, because it cannot happen. Water does not part on command. But the situation became considerably more complicated when researchers began examining the biblical account, not through the lens of supernatural intervention, but through the lens of meteorology, geography, and fluid dynamics. And what they found was that the story, read carefully in its original context, describes something that is not physically impossible at all. The critical insight begins with a translation problem that most people never encounter. The phrase commonly rendered as the Red Sea is not the most accurate translation of the original Hebrew text. A more precise translation of the term used in Exodus is the Sea of Reeds, a body of water characterized by shallow, marshy conditions and the growth of reed plants, quite different from the deep open water of the modern Red Sea. This distinction matters enormously when trying to identify where this event might have occurred and whether the physics could support it. Researchers examining the geography of ancient Egypt and the Nile Delta region identified a candidate location near the ancient site of Tanis, just south of the Mediterranean coast. Thousands of years ago, when the events of Exodus would have taken place, this area is believed to have been connected to the Nile Delta and to have featured the shallow, reed-filled conditions consistent with the Sea of Reeds described in the text. Then there is the second critical detail that most retellings of this story overlook completely. In popular culture, in films like The Ten Commandments, Moses raises his staff and the sea parts instantaneously in a single dramatic moment. But that is not what the Bible actually says. The King James translation of Exodus 14:21 reads, "The Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. The sea did not part in an instant. It receded over the course of an entire night, driven by a sustained wind." This specific detail, an overnight recession driven by wind rather than an instantaneous supernatural parting, is precisely consistent with a real meteorological phenomenon called wind set-down. Wind set-down occurs when sustained, strong winds blow across a shallow body of water for an extended period, physically pushing the water back and exposing the floor beneath. This is not a hypothetical phenomenon. It has been directly observed in modern times at the Nile Delta and at Lake Erie in North America. It is a documented, measurable, repeatable natural event. When researchers applied computer modeling to the proposed Lake Tanis location, using wind speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour sustained throughout an entire night, the model showed that the water could have been pushed back sufficiently to create a land bridge approximately 8 to 2, 5 miles in length. The models further showed that the exposed crossing would have remained viable for approximately 4 to 5 hours before the wind conditions changed and the water returned. Even accounting for the likely muddy conditions of a recently exposed lake bed, 4 to 5 hours is a completely reasonable amount of time to move a large group of people across a 2-mile land bridge. When the wind stopped, the water would have returned rapidly enough to trap anyone caught in the middle of the crossing. The drowning of Pharaoh's pursuing forces, while it would have required some degree of poor timing and military overconfidence on the part of the Egyptians, falls within the range of physical possibility under this scenario, though most researchers consider it likely to have been embellished in the retelling. What the science cannot do is confirm that this event happened. No chariot wheels have been found in Lake Tanis. No Egyptian records of a catastrophic military loss in this region during the relevant period have been discovered. But what the science has done is permanently retire the argument that the story is physically impossible. The specific details in the biblical account, the wind, the overnight duration, the gradual recession rather than instant parting, are not the embellishments of myth. They are the precise details you would expect in an accurate eyewitness description of a wind set-down event. Stories invented to glorify a miraculous rescue do not typically include the detail that the miracle took all night and was caused by weather. What emerges from all of these discoveries, taken together as a body of evidence rather than as isolated incidents, is a picture of the Bible that is significantly more historically complex than either its most passionate defenders or its most committed critics have typically acknowledged. The Bible is neither a perfectly accurate historical textbook nor a collection of invented stories with no connection to real events. It is something more interesting and more human than either of those descriptions. It is what happens when a real people with a real history record, their experiences through the cultural and religious frameworks of their time, emphasizing what matters to them, interpreting events through the lens of their beliefs about God and destiny, occasionally exaggerating the scale or completeness of their victories, but fundamentally describing real kings, real conflicts, real geographical locations, and real political dynamics that left traces in stone and clay and papyrus that archaeologists are still finding today. The Merneptah Stele confirmed that Israel existed when scholars said it might not have. The Tel Dan inscription confirmed that the dynasty of King David was real when scholars said it might be fictional. The six-chambered gates at Hazor, Gezer, and Megiddo corroborated the Bible's account of Solomon's building projects in the precise locations and time period the text describes. The Mesha Stele provided an independent, enemy-sourced confirmation of a specific biblical war described from the other side. And the science of wind set-down transformed the parting of the Sea of Reeds from an impossible miracle into a plausible natural event, described with surprising meteorological accuracy in a 3,000-year-old text. None of these discoveries prove that the Bible is the Word of God. None of them resolve the deepest theological questions that the text raises. But all of them together prove something that decades of confident scholarly dismissal had obscured, that the people who wrote the Bible were not inventing a world out of nothing. They were recording a world they had actually lived in. And the ground beneath our feet has been quietly confirming that fact, one discovery at a time, for well over a century. The question that remains open, and that each new excavation season has the potential to reshape, is not whether the Bible contains history. The question is, how much more history is still buried, waiting for the right team of archaeologists to find the right piece of stone in the right location, and force the world to revise its assumptions once again.